Welcome to Ideas in Action, the official University of Southern California podcast. This show was recorded live on USC's campus.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Aren't We American? Race, Class, Immigration, and Citizenship. We're also excited to be here today to speak to you about these various issues. I'm Jody Vallejo. I'm a professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity here at USC. I also associate direct the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. And I study immigrant integration, wealth stratification, mobility, and also Latino entrepreneurs in the Latino middle class. My first book, Barrios to Burbs, The Making of the Mexican-American Middle Class, was published by Stanford University Press. And I'm currently writing a new book on the Latino elite in Los Angeles. So I'm first going to introduce my colleagues here before I grill them with their first question. Duncan Dukin Williams is professor of religion and East Asian languages and cultures at USC. He currently serves as the director of the USC Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religion and Culture. Previously, he held the Ito Distinguished Chair of Japanese Buddhism at Berkeley. He's the author of 9 books, the latest of which is on Buddhism and the Japanese American internment. He'll be talking today about his book, American Sutra, A Story of Faith and Freedom in the Second World War, published by Harvard University Press. Elda Maria Roman is an associate professor of English at USC. She's also a scholar in literary and cultural studies. She researches the effects of race and class across groups, disciplines, and genres. And she's the author of Race and Upward Mobility, Seeking, Gatekeeping, and Other Class Strategies in Post-War America, published by Stanford University Press. And the book examines class dynamics in African American and Mexican American literature, television, and film from the 1940s to the 2000s. And her current project explores contemporary narratives about fears of changing demographics. Juan de Lara is an associate professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at USC. His research is focused on social movements and social justice, racial capitalism, which he'll be discussing more today, urban ecology, labor, and the intersections between data, race, and power. His recent book, Inland Shift, Race, Space, and Capital in Southern California, uses global commodity chains and logistics to examine how race, class, and 21st century capitalism reshaped Southern California between 1980 and 2010. And finally, Sam Ehrman is associate professor at the USC Gold School of Law. He's a scholar of history of law whose research focuses on race, citizenship, and constitutional change. He is the author of Almost Citizens, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Constitution, and Empire. Prior to arriving to USC, he was a Smithsonian Institution Latino Studies Fellow at the National Museum of American History, and also a law clerk to Justices Anthony Kennedy and John Paul Stevens, and to Judge Merrick Garland. Let's give them a big hand. And I also want to offer a word of congratulations to 3 of my colleagues who were just notified that they were awarded tenure here at USC. Congratulations to all of you. So, the history of the United States is one of racialized capitalist exploitation where criminalization, exclusion, denial of full citizenship rights, even among those who were born in the U.S., has always intersected with race to shape what it means to be American. And this history is linked to the current context in which we find ourselves, in which racialization and dehumanization of people via white nationalist politics is overt. And each of you have written really important books that help us to understand how people resist and work collectively to reframe what it means to be American. Duncan, I'm going to ask you the first question. So your book, American Sutra, A Story of Faith and Freedom in the Second World War, investigates how the Japanese community during World War II broadened America's ideas of religious freedom. Can you talk a little bit about how contestations over race, religion, and citizenship in the past have led us to where we are today?
Sure, thank you so much. This book, American Sutra, as Jody thankfully kindly noted, is this book about the World War II Japanese-American incarceration history, but from a particular lens of Buddhism. And in many ways, my argument in the book is that it wasn't just race, but the fact that the over 110,000 persons of Japanese ancestry put behind barbed wire in these camps during World War II, that community was over 2/3 Buddhist, and that was in fact a factor in why they were put in these camps. And so I have this kind of general question about that, where the World War II case is trying to explore this question of, like, is America fundamentally a white and Christian nation? A view that people like our current Vice President Mike Pence has often talked about. Or is it a multi-ethnic and religiously free nation? So that's that question drives a lot of my book, and I try to make this argument that the reason, there was surveillance on Buddhist temples prior to the war. There was making of lists and registries where groups of people like Buddhist priests were seen as a threat to national security. And, on the day of Pearl Harbor, the first person arrested, even before the smoke had cleared, was a Buddhist priest. And so we know that religion also had a role in what happened to the Japanese American community. But I think the deeper question is this a wartime hysteria thing, or is this something, a much longer enduring question in American life? And then when I think about the very first Immigration Act that is targeted about excluding a particular peoples, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the rhetoric at that time was really about, the slur word was the heathen Chinese, right? The unassimilability racially, but also the fact that they're not Christian, being what made them unwelcome in a certain kind of vision of America. And I think, sometimes it's race and sometimes it's religion that comes to the fore, but when we see language, even in our times, about a complete shutdown of, Muslims entering the United States and that kind of language, sometimes, again, we see this kind of exclusionary ideas about who can belong in America based on religion and sometimes on race. So I feel like some of these questions are related to World War II specifically, but might also be enduring questions for us.
Yeah, and so when we think about the kind of the markers that have been used to exclude race, religion, class, and others, this brings me to your book, Sam, that examines the U.S.-Puerto Rico relationship. How does a major democracy that's supposedly focused or built upon these notions of equality end up being capable of holding colonies and mimicking racist imperial powers?
Yeah, so I'm interested in my book in this question of how is the longest running preeminent democracy in the world, the United States, also home to the oldest colony on earth, Puerto Rico? And the short answer is that the United States invaded and annexed it in 1898 with its war with Spain. And my book argues about what happened afterward. So the first part of this is before 1898 in the United States, the constitutional settlement that followed the Civil War, what I call the Reconstruction Constitution, had come up with several anti-imperial strands. It held that all Americans other than American Indians were U.S. citizens, that all places within the United States other than the District of Columbia were current or future states, and that full constitutional rights extended as far as U.S. borders. By 1925, all three of these were no longer true. And And when I think about who changed them, it turns out that this change occurred in all different parts of the government and beyond. So judges played a role, but so did lawmakers, presidents, bureaucrats, fancy lawyers, and everyday people. And the way this change unfolded was in an iterative, cooperative, and creative process. Much of it had to do with ambiguity. People spoke in underdefined terms. They settled only narrow questions and left things open. They sent each other signals. They proposed things without making them into binding law. And they moved slowly, always with eyes on one another. And as they acted, they kept race firmly in mind. It shaped and animated most of the legal developments of the period, often with Puerto Rico appearing as a woman or a child in depictions of an American family. And what's going on here was the United States was still struggling with the aftermath of its Civil War. So Republicans were slowly coming to terms with the fact that Reconstruction had failed and that they were no longer standing up for African Americans. And eventually they came to embrace a version of the Constitution that turned its back on some of the things they'd put in during Reconstruction. Democrats, for their part, had originally been quite afraid of a strong federal government. They thought that it could restart Reconstruction. But as Democratic white supremacist control of the South grew seemingly impregnable, they united with Republicans around white supremacy and colonial control of people of color overseas in the colonies. And as the slow political shift happened, there was also a slow legal shift. So the Supreme Court at first signaled it was open to empire and colonialism without saying it was valid law. Then they signaled certain details might be okay. And then eventually Congress said, why don't we give Puerto Rican citizenship and strip that citizenship of rights and future statehood and self-government? And the Supreme Court eventually said that was just fine. And it was that final decision in 1922 and 1925 that laid the stage for the situation we're on today of Puerto Rico's somewhat anomalous and uneasy position within the United States.
And so you can see, again, the ways in which race and class and citizenship are used to exclude both within the United States case and the ways in which these borders become contested. Juan, I want to focus a little bit in on Southern California. And in your book, Inland Shift, you demonstrate how modern global capitalism is linked to regional economies. Talk a little bit about how these linkages transform space and also meanings of race and class.
Thank you, Jody. One of the things that I was interested is in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential elections. There was a tremendous amount of focus on the Trumpian voter, displaced blue-collar workers who were angry about the kinds of social and economic situations that was taking place in the United States. And one of the things that I realized is that this connection between economic displacement and social displacement, of course, has a much longer history and something that in California we've dealt with for the past 20 years. Mainly this idea that what happened in the post-1980s California is there were two radical shifts. One is that there was a tremendous amount of economic turmoil that totally transformed the economy. You had massive deindustrialization, the loss of tens of thousands of manufacturing blue-collar jobs, and local political leaders and economic leaders tried to make up for that kind of economic crisis by investing in new economies. And one of the things that they settled on was to support the growth of the port industries and logistics. So all you need to do is drive from the port all the way on the 710 to the 10 all the way into Riverside and San Bernardino counties, and you know what I mean when I talk about warehouses, trucks, and ports. So there was a major investment in that industry with the idea that those jobs would be able to provide the same kind of economic and social stability that allowed a post-war American generation to enjoy all of the benefits of an economic boom. And of course, not that kind of economic prosperity and what we've called the American dream was not equally available to everyone. Much of that was aligned along racial and gendered lines, where the overwhelming majority of the population that benefited from that kind of economic boom and blue-collar wages that allowed people to support their families were overwhelmingly white. And a lot of Black Americans and Asian American workers and Latinx workers didn't enjoy the same kinds of benefits. And so I was interested in thinking about, so if we have a new kind of economy in this kind of globalization period that transformed Southern California, what is the future for a new generation of LA that looks radically different from that post-war period? We have to remember that prior to 1980, Southern California, LA County was overwhelmingly white. The majority of the population was white. When that economic shift happens, California is also transforming into a mostly a pluralistic society, and where the Latinx population becomes the majority. And so the question really becomes, what is going to be, what are the kinds of economic opportunities that will be in place for this emerging majority at a time in which we've disinvested from social spending in terms of education spending, and the overwhelming majority of the jobs that are growing have been in low-paying service sectors and in some cases the logistics industry. And so, you know, a lot of times there's a conflation that takes place, a blaming of and for the kinds of economic consequences that happen because of globalization and radical changes in global capitalism, blaming people that are also emerging as a new majority during that time. And so there's a blaming of the new Latinx majority, the immigrant population, for the kind of economic displacement that occurs and is really wreaking havoc on many people's lives.
Yeah, and so all three of your books are really important because they analyze these specific moments in history where there were multiple intersections at the local level, at the political level, to reproduce these kinds of economic and racialized inequalities that persist to today. And your book, Elda Maria, really invites us to think of these issues from a cultural studies perspective. You analyze literature, film, and television in the post-war period. How can cultural studies then help us to understand race and class inequalities and what it means to be American?
Yeah, thank you. So as you mentioned, my book examines class dynamics in African American and Mexican American television, literature, and film from the 1940s to the present. And I specifically look at the genre of the upward mobility narrative. And this is an expansive genre. It includes aspirational stories, so stories about people wanting to get out of poverty, get access to resources. Think of the Will Smith movie, The Pursuit of Happiness, or Elena Maria Viramontes' novel, Under the Feet of Jesus, about migrant farm workers. So really sincere desires for more resources, you know, ways to help others. It also includes stories that are critical of what individual upward mobility means in relation to a collective, and if upward mobility means adopting value systems like classism, colorism, xenophobia, right? Value systems associated with dominant group inclusion. And so because these narratives can be both aspirational or critical, they are both products of and resistant to capitalism, white supremacy, and the hierarchies that those systems create. And what these narratives do is that they reflect and model the ways in which people and communities work within and against social and economic hierarchies. So for example, I start the book off with a discussion of two Georges, George Jefferson from the 1970s and 80s sitcom The Jeffersons, and George Lopez from the early 2000s ABC sitcom The George Lopez Show. And what these series play out constantly is this crisis of allegiance. Which side will they be on? Will they side with those in power against those without it? Will they try to change power dynamics? So for example, on the first episode of The Jeffersons, George George Jefferson and his wife Louise have just moved into a East Side high-rise New York apartment, and his wife Louise has become friends with this woman who cleans the other apartments in their building, and she wants to be friends with her. Her name is Diane. While her husband really wants to hire Diane as their maid because he wants to prove that he belongs as a building resident, and he wants to assert an elevated status above domestic workers. And his wife constantly pushes back against him. On the George Lopez show, the first episode plays out how he's just been promoted as manager after 15 years on the assembly line. He works at an airplane parts factory. And the question that is asked of that episode is, will he side with management over workers? So his employers, who are aptly called the Powers Brothers, they ask him to fire either his mother or his best friend in order to cut costs, right? They're testing his loyalty to power. And that question constantly comes up throughout that series. By the end of the series, that show definitively answers he sides with the workers. And so through these crises, right, in these conflicts about hiring and firing, what they're playing out is this tension between the individual and the collective, right? So these narratives ask, do you care only about the me or do you care about the we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the specific findings and contributions of your books. Sam, give us an example of how citizenship and belonging is forged in the context of empire among the me and the we.
Thank you. Let me tell you a story about a woman named Isabel Gonzalez, who was 20 years old when she decided to move from Puerto Rico to the United States. She was pregnant with her second child, and her husband had just died of tuberculosis, so she was in economic crisis, and followed her brother to New York, thinking, well, now Puerto Rico's part of the United States, I'll be allowed to go there. And when she got to Ellis Island, they turned her back and said, you're an undesirable alien, you're not allowed in. And her brother came to Ellis Island to try to convince them that she should be allowed in. And his tactic was something that might have worked back under Spanish rule. He said, the reason she's pregnant is somebody seduced her. And we found the guy, and we found the police, and we're going to force them to get married. And the immigration inspectors sort of go wide-eyed and say, you're going to have a marriage without the husband's consent? And Luis, her brother, says, yes. And this does not work. And they exclude her. But fortunately, she has an uncle, Domingo, who brings a lawsuit saying she's a citizen. And the lawsuit makes it to the Supreme Court. And Domingo finds the best lawyer in the country for these kinds of cases. And they argue before the Supreme Court that Puerto Ricans are citizens. And what the Supreme Court says is, we don't know whether you're citizens, but you're pretty clearly not aliens. So we think Puerto Ricans should be able to come into the United States. And here is an example of the Supreme Court creating a new law for empire through ambiguity. So they're saying, look, we don't have to decide if you're citizens. You're probably not, but we're not going to say that out loud. But we're also going to allow you to come to the United States, in part because Puerto Ricans could provide useful labor. And Isabel Gonzalez is not happy with this decision. So in one sense, she's won. Her whole family moves to New York. She becomes the matriarch of a large family that now has great-grandchildren all over the country. She has a middle-class life. But she also starts writing published letters to the editor of the New York Times, where she says, this is an outrage, what's happened to me. And she picks up her brother's script of the illegal seduction and says, you have treated me like a criminal. You put me in jail while my case was pending, but you put me in jail for your own crime. You, the United States, seduced Puerto Rico into joining with claims that we would be full members, that we would join a liberal democracy. And instead, you've held us as a colony. And so she speaks about how the promises turned out to be nothing more than things that should be thrown in a wastebasket. And so her life in some ways ends up being about how it is that she's able to make things better for her family, how she's able to find opportunity and progress, and at the same time, how she's able to put herself forward as someone who wants to speak on behalf of the community, even though doing so is always a reminder that people had judged her not good enough to come to the United States. And so she puts reputation of herself in some ways behind what she thinks of are the claims that her community should be making public.
And so these kinds of attempts to exclude, but also to kind of resist and work among the collective also occur at the regional level. And your book takes up this question that as kind of the demographics of the Inland Empire were transforming, there was this kind of movement of the Latinx population from LA and the coastal regions into the Inland Empire. There was this backlash by these very white conservative politicians and leaders that, you write in your book, mastered the art of tapping into racial anxiety and economic despair by linking the region's economic crisis to immigration. Does that sound familiar to anybody? But what were the consequences of these very like racialized regional politics, anti-immigrant politics, and how did people and social movements work together to remap what it means to be American and belonging in this context?
Yeah, I like the story. And so one of the things that I do in the book is to use stories in order to try to get some of the boring academic points that I have to make at the beginning of the book into like language that my mom would understand, right? And so let me tell you a story about a woman that I interviewed. Her name is Marta, and she's featured in my book. And Marta, I think, embodies the kind of, person that I think about when we have these conversations. When Jody asked me to be involved in this panel, and the topic and the question was, "Aren't we Americans?" I wondered, right, who is asked that question, and how many times I have had to tell people that I am American. And one of the things that has always strikes me is that there's a difference between American through being American as an American citizen and then being American as in being legible as somebody who belongs, right? And I think that's the question for this panel, who we tell different stories. And this woman that I talked to in my book and I write about in my book, her name is Marta, and she migrated to the United States from El Salvador. And she had to leave her son behind her because she could not afford to bring him with her. She hopped into the trunk of a car in Tijuana and came to the United States as an undocumented worker. She lands in the city of Ontario after a long journey, and she immediately goes out to look for a job, and the only job she can find is in a warehouse in the Inland Empire. And Marta isn't just represents tens of thousands of people. Marta represents the same kind of story as my parents, both of whom came to this country as undocumented immigrants and worked in this country as immigrant farm workers since they were young children when their parents brought them, right? My mom has been to Mexico once, and my dad hated going there because it reminded him of the kind of poverty that he had to escape. And so the story that Marta embodies in my book is really the story about families like mine. And one of the things that she and that was particularly powerful is when she tells me about having to go to work in a warehouse where she was packing boxes and unpacking boxes that ended up at the Walmart store in town, saying to me, I came here for this thing that they call the American dream. And what I found was something else entirely than what I had imagined. But together with the workers that she started organizing with and saying there should be better working conditions. Women should not be, disallowed from going to the restroom when they have to go. And she was particularly treated poorly when she was pregnant. And her supervisor says, "You come to this country to work, not to have babies," right? And this idea of Marta then taking all of that and turning her individual desire for a better life into a collective desire for transforming what it means to live the American dream. Because for Marta, it stopped being about individual achievement and accomplishment, right? And it started to be about how do we work together to make sure that workers who work in this industry, that women especially who work in these industries, are treated like human beings, first and foremost. And I think when I talked earlier about this tremendous amount of transformation that has taken place, this idea of a sense of displacement, right? That people are being displaced. One of the things that we have to remember is the kind of American dream that is embodied in a single family home with 2 children and a car, and you being able to go to high school and graduate and go to work and to support your family. That was built as an American dream through collective struggle when workers decided that they needed to organize for better wages. We wouldn't have the kinds of ideas of the American dream without the kinds of policies and economic foundations that were made possible by workers who at one point made a choice to sort of create a collective image of an ideal life. Right? It wasn't just a pursuit for their own individual well-being. And if you look at history, if you look at the kind of post-war boom that took place, if you look at this idea of you being able to go to high school, get a job after school, and be able to live a middle-class lifestyle, a lot of that was built on the kind of social organizing and social movement organizing that I write about in this book.
And that's one of the things that, I'm a big fan of your book, all of your books, of course, but that's one of the things that I really appreciate about your work is you bring in the testimonies of workers themselves and organizations that are working along with workers to demand better working conditions and really change kind of the shifts that global capitalism has made in these kind of regional spaces. Elda Maria, tell us about how these tensions play out in film and television. You write a lot about these different kind of archetypes in film and television that are struggling with these very same things.
Yeah, I look at narratives that play out exactly what you're talking about, collective efforts to change social and economic conditions, and also how there can be individuals and groups that police the boundaries, group boundaries, and attempt to change those conditions. And so I find that in surveying a wide range of cultural production, that there are 4 recurring character types that appear in ethnic upward mobility narratives. These are status seekers, gatekeepers, conflicted artists, and mediators. And while these characters make individual choices, they reflect broader patterns. So the gatekeeper is that type that polices group boundaries, polices attempts to access resources or to change conditions. And in one chapter, I examine how the gatekeeper is represented through racialized law enforcement figures. So for example, in Latinx immigration films that have arisen in the 2000s, there are portrayals of Mexican-American Border Patrol agents that reflect a relatively new phenomenon, the fact that the majority of Border Patrol agents are now Latinx. And these films, like The Gatekeeper, 2002 film, Machete, or the Robert Rodriguez film, Sleep Dealer, the Alex Rivera film, they all play out a scenario that's also traced in the 1994 film by Charles Burnett that features a black police officer, where you have agents of a repressive system who are directly or inadvertently harming racialized people, like migrants trying to cross the border or black people abused in a sheriff's department. And you have those agents undergo a change of consciousness, gain awareness that they are participating in an exploitive economy and an exploitive system, the criminalization of racialized others. And you have them undergo a change, so where they start off being gatekeepers, they end up being mediators, people who try to help co-ethnics and try to bring awareness to the fact that this criminalization system is an exploitive economy.
So, Duncan, I have to tell you that when I read your book, you had me crying by the end of the introduction. Can you just tell us a little bit about the discovery that you made that led to the writing of your book and how the Japanese Buddhist community during World War II dealt with these tensions?
Sure, thank you. Just because people mention stories, maybe I should tell the story of how I got into this book and the story of the individual who kind of inspired me. I mentioned earlier that Buddhism was one of the reasons why the government looked to this community with suspicion, but Buddhism was also the resource that people drew on their faith at a time of dislocation, at a time of loss. People sometimes turn to these values within. And I first learned about this when I just finished grad school, and it's a little bit embarrassing. This book took me like over 17 years from conception to completion. But right after grad school, my professor passed away, my main mentor, and his wife asked me to clean his office. I went to his office, and I discovered something while I was cleaning it, which was his father's World War II diary from Manzanar, one of the wartime camps. And his father was a Buddhist priest, and he would write in this diary about his experiences in camp. And so I shared that with his wife, my professor's now widowed wife, and she was, I guess, only 10 years old at the time when World War II broke out, and she was unlike my professor. She was born in the U.S., in Madera, California. At that time, Central Valley, a lot of Japanese American farming families. And so she told me this story, which is what kind of inspired me to keep at it for 17 years. She told me that she was only 10. She comes back home after school, and she sees, this is a few days after Pearl Harbor, her dad being beaten by some men in suits at the front door. And she peers in to the kitchen where the kitchen table is, and she sees her mother sitting really still with somebody pointing a shotgun to her mom's head. She's only 10, but she kind of knew that she needed to step in because her parents from Wakayama Prefecture, Japan, they didn't speak very much English, and clearly these men in suits, who she'd learned later were FBI agents, didn't speak Japanese. So she had to interpret, and it turned out that in that interpretation, it became clear, these are government officials, they're there, and they mentioned that they're there because her dad was a prominent member of the Madera Buddhist Temple's board of directors, and that because he was on a list, and they needed to interrogate him. And that he, in turn, at that time, was just in the lettuce fields, there were some rabbits or something, so he had his own shotgun to scare them off, but that was the precise moment when the agents had arrived, and so the confusion follows. A few days later, the dad's like, we're Buddhists, but we're not a threat to national security. And he asks his daughter to build a little fire that, in the old school Japanese ofuro, or a bathtub, they use firewood, and it was one of her chores. So she didn't think much of it, but he scoured the house and found anything that had "made in Japan" or kanji or Japanese lettering on it, and threw it in the fire. And for her, the most disturbing thing was he collected, it's called the Hinamatsuri Ningyo, that's like Girls' Day special doll set, as kind of like too culturally Japanese. So he throws that in the fire. But then he has this one set of things he hesitates about throwing in the fire, and it's a Buddhist sutra or a scripture that had been handed down generation after generation. And also because he was on the board of the temple, he had all the minutes of the board from the founding of the temple to the December 1941, and he's like, I can't get myself to throw that in the fire. And so he ultimately, long story short, he buries that in a tin box. The family have to sell their farm. They come back after the war, hoping to, come back to their home, and then they find that the new owners, they had to sell it for 1/20th of the market value, are demanding the full market value, so they can't buy their farm back. And they have relatives in LA, but he's like, I got to find that box, and ultimately can't find it. The new owners had torn down the large trees in the garage that had marked the spot where the tin box had been buried. But for me, this story says two things. One, that they try to burn away their Japaneseness, but they refused to burn away their faith, their Buddhist faith. And somehow in the soil of California is still today buried Buddhist teachings, scriptures, and history of a community. And my book is about trying to retrieve, we can't retrieve that box. And sometimes these memories are also buried, but we need to retrieve this history of people who were saying, the government is telling us we don't belong, but we're going to claim something. We're going to say we can be both Buddhist and American. And to me, that's kind of also what I'm hearing from the other panelists. It's like, there's agency there. There's a way that you have to kind of, even in the most difficult of times, embody some of these things, ideas, to make it real. And I think religious freedom is no different.
Can I share a story quickly?
Yes.
So as you mentioned earlier, I got to clerk for Justice Anthony Kennedy when he was still on the court. And only once did I remember him actually talking about a moment of race discrimination he'd experienced. And it was the moment of watching Japanese neighbors having to abandon property to move to the camps. And he didn't say much about it, but it was one of these rare moments where he spoke in a way that was really, it was sort of emotional in a way where you could tell that his way of thinking about these matters had been kind of formatively shaped by this and was in a way that was hard to articulate, right? So it just resonated on like a kind of emotional or kind of somehow deeply internal level. And he'd been young at the time, so it was mixed with trying to process it with his parents, and but it clearly had really shaken him to see it, and he sort of came back to it when he thought about race much later in life.
Thank you for sharing.
So I just want to ask each of you to just take a minute and thinking about the discussion today and the work that you've done in the past and kind of where you're going in the future. How do you see the idea of what it means to be American, this idea of citizenship and belonging, evolving, especially considering this time that is extremely demoralizing and scary to so many of us? Take it away,
Okay.
Elda Maria.
I think the question or the challenge, right, which has always been the challenge, is that we're not just American, we're Americans, right? We are a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual country, and there are many ways of being American. And I think of the country's motto, right, e pluribus unum, right, out of many one, and yet how that ideal of the one has largely benefited one racial group and created an economic elite. And so how do we account for the fact that there are many Americans, and even if we are experiencing a change of demographics, right, it's estimated that by the middle of the 21st century, we're going to be a majority-minority country. The change in demographics doesn't undo the fact that there are historic inequities, right? So just with the change of population doesn't mean we've undone all of the past policies and structures that have benefited some over others. So I think the challenge is, how do we work for the many, for a collective that is fractured and disparate?
Sure. I suppose I remember when I started doing my research, I focus a lot on citizenship, and people would sometimes ask, why do you care about citizenship rights? Why don't you talk more about human rights? And the question comes from the idea that citizenship rights are the rights for the insiders. There's lots of people who aren't citizens and don't get them. And even within citizenship, we have lots of hierarchies and exclusions. And so citizenship rights sometimes feel inadequate. And I think we're now living through another moment that reminds us that we can't turn our back on patriotism and Americanness, that nations and nationalism and national belongings are incredibly powerful, and we have to work with them. They are something in the world. And I'm a historian, and I'm a historian of a period where things go badly. So I'm a historian of a period where we had a moment of Reconstruction, and we thought we were creating an egalitarian republic, and instead, for over half a century, things got worse and worse and worse before they got better. And so I don't have a prediction of where things go, but I guess I share your sense. It's an important moment because things don't have to get better. In some ways, it's up to us, right? It's up to the choices we make and that our country people make that will determine whether or not we're on the cusp of something that's rising or something that's declining.
Maybe I could add on just to that point that, you often hear like, we're in such an unprecedented moment, and I think if you work on history and you look at these moments in the past, you're like, okay, but you know what? I think it's more like a pendulum. You have these moments in American history towards a certain kind of nativism that is a narrow version of what it means to be American, and it often takes people to swing it the other way, but it does also have, American history also has moments where it becomes more open, becomes more multiple instead of singular or supremacist. And so, and that's on many different levels, religious level, race level, etc. And so I'm heartened, for example, by just little things. Like just the other day I had it was like a PRI, NPR kind of like radio article about one of my friends, Reverend Ron Kobata. He's in the historically Japanese American temple, over 100-year history in San Francisco. He was part of this pilgrimage to one of the camps outside of San Antonio, Texas, called Crystal City. And they went on the pilgrimage. He gave his usual service at the site of the former camp. And then they marched to the South Texas detention facility for children and women, 2,000 plus. This is a camp back in World War II, Crystal City, Texas. That was a so-called family reunification camp. The fathers had been arrested by the FBI, and in 1944-45, they were reunited with their children and mothers. So for the people who camp survivors and their descendants, they know that history of family in their bones. And so they took, and before they went to Texas, in Japanese culture, the crane is a kind of symbol of a more hopeful, peaceful future. And they made 25,000 origami cranes, and they called it the Tsuru for Solidarity Project. And they went on that march to that facility, and on the fencing, put all of the cranes. And to me, like, that's the type of little glimmers of hope I see that might be able to swing things back.
One.
Yeah, I think, it's great to hear everybody talk about things, and I continue to remind myself about the long arc of history, and that we have had these crises in America where we have had to redefine what it means to be American, right? And I think one of the things that's clear to me is that we are living in another moment of crisis. And as sort of traumatic and dramatic as it is also a tremendous opportunity for us to redefine what it means to be American. And one of that means just to think about that as an inclusive definition, rather than one of displacement or feeling like a certain kind of country is being lost. In that process of, we can also imagine that we are forging a new kind of society, a new kind of country that brings us in that kind of path of we've always had to go back and try to redefine what America is, because we have been trying to fix the ways in which we've taken the wrong paths in the past, right? And it's always been by people being involved and active and engaged citizens. And I think we're in that space now. And some of it is some basic, the reason I love hearing my colleagues' stories is that there's a reminder there that in this forging of what it means to be American together, right, there's sometimes a confusion. And I tell my students this all the time and they laugh at me, but I'm being very honest. It's like, I don't have to like you and you don't have to like me, right? And you don't have to like my food or the fact that I speak another language. But there is a basic core principle that we think we need to agree on, and that is that you cannot erase me as a human being, right? That we have to figure out a way to think about ourselves as Americans, rooted in this principle of a shared humanity that we are trying to improve throughout this arc of history. And I think that is where we're at now, right? And I sometimes am very pessimistic when I think about, all of the kind of political conversation that we have, the fact that at this moment, we have children in detention centers, right, without their families. There are a lot of ways to think about these in these pessimistic moments. And yet I also know that people of many different colors, of many different ethnicities and racial backgrounds also understand that there's a basic shared humanity there, that we need to work together to make sure that this stuff doesn't happen in the future in a way where those children are dehumanized in order to make a political point, right?
Yeah, I completely agree with all of you. I think that we're at a really important moment in our history where we can think of a more radical future for us and what it means to be American. Thank you for ending us on that note. And I really want to thank all of you for writing these remarkable books, all of which really investigate and examine these precarious crises moments in our history, but that provide us with hope and with thinking about how we can engage in decolonization and create a more radically inclusive vision for us and our future. So thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and visit us at podcast.usc.edu.